Karen Whitmore stood frozen in her pristine kitchen, her manicured fingers gripping the granite countertop so tightly her knuckles had turned bone white. Through her spotless bay window, she watched in mounting horror as her neighbor's bratty, 16-year-old son, Tyler Chen, executed what could only be described as the most audacious theft in Willowbrook Estate's 20-year history. He was stealing her pool, not metaphorically, not temporarily borrowing it for a quick dip. Tyler Chen, that lanky menace with his ridiculous man bun and designer swim trunks, was literally dragging her brand-new inflatable pool across the perfectly manicured grass that separated their properties, leaving a trail of crushed petunias in his wake. That little Karen's voice caught in her throat as she watched Tyler heave the massive pool, her $400 deluxe model with built-in cup holders and LED lighting over the decorative fence that marked the property line. The fence she'd fought the HOA for 3 months to get approved. The fence that was exactly regulation height and painted in approved Willowbrook white. The pool landed with a satisfying thud in the Chun's backyard, sending their elderly golden retriever, Mr. Whiskers, scampering for cover behind their garden gnome collection. Karen had tried to get those gnomes banned too, citing Regulation 14.7b about visually disruptive lawn ornaments, but the HOA board had inexplicably ruled against her. Karen's phone buzzed on the counter, and she glanced down to see a text from her son Derek. "Mom, borrowed your pool for my pool party. Thanks." Her perfectly applied mascara began to smudge as her eye twitched, a dangerous sign that her husband Mike had learned to recognize over their 18 years of marriage. The last time Karen's eye had twitched like this, she'd gotten the entire 4th grade bake sale shut down because Jennifer Morrison used store-bought cookies and tried to pass them off as homemade. Michael. Karen's voice echoed through their 2-story colonial with the force of a foghorn. Michael, her husband, appeared in the kitchen doorway, still wearing his weekend uniform of cargo shorts and a faded Cubs t-shirt that violated at least 3 of Karen's personal dress codes. His graying hair stuck up at odd angles, and he clutched a half-eaten sandwich like a shield. "What's wrong now, Karen?" Mike asked, though his tone suggested he already regretted the question. "Look." Karen jabbed her finger toward the window with such violence that Mike actually flinched. "Look at what that delinquent is doing to our property value." Mike squinted through the window and watched as Tyler began filling the stolen pool with a garden hose, whooping with joy as his friends started arriving for what appeared to be an impromptu pool party. "Isn't that your pool from the garage?" "Oh, you are pool?" Karen corrected, her voice rising to a pitch that made their Persian cat, Princess Whiskers, flee the room. Derek took it without asking. "Michael, what kind of message does this send to the neighborhood? What precedent are we setting?" Mike took a cautious bite of his sandwich. After nearly 2 decades of marriage, he'd learned that Karen's neighborhood crises required careful navigation. One wrong word could turn a minor pool incident into a 6-month war that would end with at least 3 families putting up for sale signs. "Maybe we should just don't." Karen held up one perfectly manicured finger. "Don't you dare suggest we let it slide or pick our battles. This is about respect, Michael. This is about property rights. This is about the very foundation of civilized society." Through the window, they watched as more teenagers arrived at the Chen house, each one adding to what was rapidly becoming the loudest, most chaotic pool party Willowbrook Estates had ever witnessed. Someone had brought a Bluetooth speaker that was currently blasting music at what Karen estimated to be at least 15 decibels, above the community's noise ordinance limits. "I'm calling the HOA," Karen announced, reaching for her phone with the determination of a general preparing for battle. "Karen, it's Saturday. The HOA office isn't. I'm calling Margaret directly." Mike's sandwich fell to the floor. Margaret Hendricks was the HOA president, a stern woman in her 60s who took the community guidelines as seriously as Karen did. The two women had maintained an uneasy alliance over the years, united in their shared belief that Willowbrook Estates should be a bastion of order and respectability. But they'd also clashed numerous times over what Mike privately called the great regulation debates of suburban hell. Karen was already dialing. She paced across the kitchen like a caged tiger, her designer sandals clicking against the tile with military precision. "Margaret, it's Karen Whitmore." "Yes, I know it's Saturday, but we have a situation." "No, not the Hendersons' wind chimes again. This is much worse." Mike watched his wife transform into what he'd come to think of as HOA Karen, a version of his wife that was 30% more intense, 50% more articulate, and 100% more likely to turn a minor neighborhood dispute into a federal case. "Margaret, I'm looking at a flagrant violation of multiple community standards happening right now. Property theft, noise violations, and what appears to be an unsanctioned gathering that clearly exceeds the 10-person limit for backyard events." Karen paused, listening to Margaret's response, her expression growing more thunderous by the second. "What do you mean boys? Will be boys?" "Margaret, this isn't about gender. This is about—" Karen's voice cut off abruptly, and Mike could hear Margaret's voice rising on the other end of the line, though he couldn't make out the words. "I see," Karen said finally, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. I see. So you're telling me that because Derek is technically a resident of Willowbrook Estates, he has the right to take community property. It's not community property, Karen, Mike interjected quietly. It's our pool. Karen whirled on him with the fury of a tornado touching down in Kansas. Not helping. She returned to the phone. Margaret, I understand your position, but I fundamentally disagree with your interpretation of Regulation 7.3 regarding property usage by minor dependents. I'll be filing a formal complaint first thing Monday morning. The call ended with Karen stabbing the hang-up button with enough force to crack her screen protector. She hung up on me, Karen said, staring at her phone in disbelief. Margaret Hendricks, HOA president for 6 years, pillar of this community, hung up on me because I wanted to discuss a clear violation of our community standards. Mike watched as something shifted in his wife's expression. The righteous anger was still there, but now it was joined by something else, something that looked suspiciously like calculation. Karen, Mike said slowly, recognizing the look that had preceded some of her most legendary neighborhood victories. What are you thinking? Karen walked to the window and gazed out at the chaos in the Chen's backyard. Tyler had apparently invited half his high school, and the pool party was now in full swing. Her beautiful inflatable pool, the one she'd researched for weeks. The one with the perfect color scheme that complemented their backyard's aesthetic was being used as the centerpiece for what could only be described as teenage mayhem. They want to play games? Karen murmured, her voice carrying the kind of quiet menace that had once convinced the entire PTA to ban gluten from school fundraisers. Fine, we'll play games. Karen, did you know, Karen continued, still staring out the window, that the city municipal code requires all temporary pools to be emptied and cleaned every 72 hours to prevent mosquito breeding? Mike felt a familiar sinking sensation in his stomach. Karen, please don't. And did you also know that noise ordinances apply to all gatherings? Regardless of the age of the participants or the day of the week? Honey, and most importantly, Karen turned away from the window, her eyes gleaming, with the kind of inspiration that had once led her to convince 3 different city departments to investigate the Hendersons' illegally tall mailbox. Did you know that the Chen family has been using their sprinkler system outside of the designated watering hours for the past 2 weeks? Mike closed his eyes. Karen, what are you planning? I'm not planning anything, Michael. I'm simply going to ensure that all community standards are being followed. It's my duty as a responsible homeowner and a member of this community. She walked to the kitchen drawer where she kept what Mike had nicknamed her battle folder, a meticulously organized collection of HOA regulations, city ordinances, and phone numbers for every municipal department, from animal control to zoning enforcement. Karen, it's just a pool party. Derek's having fun with his friends. Tyler seems like a good kid. Tyler Chen is a property thief, Karen corrected, pulling out a sheet of paper covered in her neat handwriting. And his parents are negligent supervisors who allow their minor child to steal from neighbors and then host unsanctioned gatherings that violate at least 7 different community standards. She began making notes on her legal pad, her handwriting flowing across the page with the precision of a court stenographer. Mike recognized the signs of Karen in full operational mode, and he knew from experience that nothing he said would derail her now. What's the first step? Mike asked, resigned to his fate as an accomplice in whatever neighborhood warfare Karen was about to unleash. Documentation, Karen replied without looking up from her notes. I need photos, timestamps, noise level, measurements, and a complete inventory of violations. Then I need to research the Chen family's compliance history and identify any Karen woke up at 5:47 a.m. on Sunday morning with the kind of clarity that usually only came to her during the final moments of a particularly heated HOA meeting. She'd spent most of the night researching municipal codes, property law, and what she'd discovered was a fascinating loophole in the Willowbrook Estates community charter that no one including Margaret Hendricks seemed to know existed. She slipped out of bed without waking Mike, who was snoring softly with his face buried in a pillow that read, World's Okayest Husband, a Father's Day gift from Derek, that Karen had initially found inappropriate but had eventually grown to appreciate for its honest assessment of her husband's middle-of-the-road approach to most situations. Karen's first stop was her home office, a perfectly organized space that served as the command center for her various neighborhood improvement campaigns. The walls were covered with laminated copies of HOA regulations, city ordinances, and what Mike called her wall of victory, framed letters of thanks from city officials, photos from successful community initiatives, and her certificate of completion from a weekend seminar on effective community leadership that she'd attended 3 years ago. She powered up her laptop and opened the document she'd been working on until 2 a.m., a comprehensive analysis of property rights and community standards in Willowbrook Estates, a legal and ethical framework for resident equality. The document was already 17 pages long and growing. Karen poured herself a cup of coffee from the programmable coffee maker that she'd set the night before, because proper planning was the foundation of all successful operations, and settled. And for what she anticipated would be a very productive morning, her first task was to document yesterday's violations. She opened a new spreadsheet and began creating what she mentally titled, The Pool Party Incident, a case study in selective enforcement. Time, 2:47 p.m. Unauthorized removal of property from 12:47. Maple Lane participants, Derek Whitmore resident, Tyler Chen non-resident minor violation, property appropriation without owner consent. HOA response, none. Time 3:15 p.m. Noise violation exceeding community standards, decibel level, estimated 78 decibels, community standard, 65 decibels, maximum. Duration, ongoing 4 hours. HOA response, none. Time 3:30 p.m. Unsanctioned gathering exceeding occupancy limits participants, 23 individuals, community standard, 10-person maximum. 4 backyard gatherings. Duration, ongoing. HOA response, none. Ren continued documenting violations until she had a comprehensive list of 14 separate infractions that had occurred during Tyler's pool party. 14 violations that Margaret Hendricks had dismissed as boys being boys, but Karen's research the night before had revealed something interesting. According to the original Willowbrook Estates Community Charter, the founding document that established the neighborhood's governance structure, any resident had the right to call for a community standards review if they could document a pattern of selective enforcement by the HOA board. The process hadn't been used in the 20-year history of Willowbrook Estates, primarily because Karen had been the only resident who'd ever bothered to read the charter in its entirety. But buried in Article 7, Section 12, subsection C, she'd found exactly what she needed. Karen picked up her phone and scrolled through her contacts until she found the number for Janet Morrison, the neighborhood's only practicing attorney. Janet lived 3 houses down and was generally regarded as a quiet, reasonable woman who kept to herself and maintained an impeccable garden that had won the Best Landscaping award for 3 consecutive years. What most people didn't know about Janet, but what Karen had discovered during her exhaustive research into every resident's professional background, was that Janet specialized in property law and had successfully argued 2 cases before the state Supreme Court. Janet, it's Karen Whitmore. I'm sorry to call so early, but I have a legal question that I think you might find interesting. Karen could hear the wariness in Janet's voice when she responded. Karen, if this is about the Hendersons' wind chimes, again, it's not about wind chimes, Karen interrupted. It's about selective enforcement of community standards and potential violations of the equal protection clauses in our community charter. There was a long pause. I'm listening, Janet said finally. Karen smiled. She'd learned over the years that the key to getting people's attention was to frame neighborhood disputes in terms of larger principles. Everyone might roll their eyes at complaints about pool parties, but no one could ignore questions about fundamental fairness and legal compliance. Janet, are you familiar with Article 7 of our community charter? Specifically, the provisions regarding community standards reviews? Another pause, longer this time. Karen, are you telling me you want to challenge the HOA board's authority? I'm telling you that I want to ensure equal enforcement of community standards for all residents, Karen replied, and I have documentation suggesting that certain residents are being held to different standards than others. How much documentation? Karen looked at her computer screen, which now displayed multiple spreadsheets, 17 pages of legal analysis, and a folder containing 47 photographs from yesterday's pool party. Comprehensive documentation, Karen said. I'll be over in an hour, Janet replied. And Karen, this better be good. After hanging up, Karen returned to her research with renewed focus. If she was going to challenge the HOA board, she needed to be absolutely certain of her legal ground. Margaret Hendricks might have dismissed her as an overzealous busybody, but Karen was about to prove that her attention to detail and thorough understanding of community regulations were actually significant legal advantages. An hour later, Janet Morrison stood in Karen's kitchen, wearing weekend clothes that somehow still managed to look professional, and reviewing the documentation that Karen had assembled with the focused attention of someone evaluating evidence for a court case. This is impressive, Janet said finally, looking up from Karen's 17-page analysis. And frankly, it's better research than I've seen from some paralegals. Karen felt a surge of pride. So you think I have a case? I think you have several cases, Janet replied. The question is whether you really want to pursue this. What do you mean? Janet set down the papers and looked at Karen with the kind of serious expression that had probably intimidated opposing counsel in courtrooms across the state. Karen, what you're proposing would essentially force a complete review of every HOA decision made in the past 2 years. You're talking about challenging the authority of the current board, potentially triggering new elections, and completely restructuring how community standards are enforced in Willowbrook Estates. Good, Karen said without hesitation. Janet raised an eyebrow. You understand that this won't just affect Margaret Hendricks, right? This will impact every resident in the neighborhood. People who have been getting away with minor violations will suddenly find themselves facing enforcement. Neighbors who have been ignoring regulations will be forced to comply. You're talking about turning this entire community upside down? Karen walked to her kitchen window and looked out at her backyard, where her beautiful inflatable pool had been until yesterday. The empty space where it had sat looked like a wound in her otherwise perfect landscape design. Janet, for 20 years, I've tried to be the reasonable neighbor. I volunteered my time, followed every rule, and worked within the system to maintain the standards that make this community special. And what has that gotten me? She turned back to face Janet, her voice gaining strength with each word. My own son steals my property, my neighbors ignore regulations, and the HOA president tells me that I'm the problem because I actually expect people to follow the rules they agreed to when they moved here. Janet nodded slowly. I understand your frustration, but do you know what I discovered last night? Karen interrupted. I discovered that the Chen family has been in violation of the lawn care schedule for 6 months. I discovered that the Hendersons have never gotten proper approval for their wind chime installation. I discovered that at least 12 families in this neighborhood are currently in violation of regulations that I've been cited for in the past. Karen walked to her computer and pulled up another spreadsheet, this one titled Comprehensive Neighborhood Compliance Analysis. I've been the only resident actually following the rules. Karen continued, while everyone else gets to pick and choose which regulations apply to them. That's not community standards, Janet. That's favoritism. Janet studied the spreadsheet, her expression growing more serious as she scrolled through Karen's meticulous documentation. You've been busy, Janet said finally. I've been thorough, Karen corrected, and I've discovered that Margaret Hendricks has been running this HOA like her personal fiefdom instead of the democratic community organization it's supposed to be. Janet closed the laptop and looked at Karen with what appeared to be grudging respect. All right, Janet said. Let's say we pursue this. What exactly do you want to accomplish? Karen had been waiting for this question. She'd spent most of the night thinking about her ultimate goals, and she'd finally crystallized her vision into a plan that was both ambitious and, she believed, completely achievable. I want fair and equal enforcement of community standards, Karen began. I want transparent decision-making processes. Margaret Hendricks lived in the largest house in Willowbrook Estates, a sprawling Tudor-style mansion that had been the model home when the development was first built. Karen had always found it slightly pretentious that the HOA president lived in the most expensive property in the neighborhood, but she'd never said anything because Margaret's house was also the most meticulously maintained and served as an example of the community's highest standards. Today, as Karen walked up the circular driveway, carrying her leather portfolio and wearing her most professional blazer, she found herself noticing details about Margaret's property that she'd previously overlooked. The fountain in the front yard that wasn't mentioned in the original architectural plans, the decorative lighting that exceeded the community's guidelines for outdoor illumination, the garden gnomes that were significantly larger than the ones she'd tried to have banned from the Chen family's yard. Karen smiled grimly. Her research had been even more thorough than she'd initially realized. Margaret answered the door, wearing a silk blouse and pearls, her Sunday afternoon uniform, that somehow managed to make everyone else feel underdressed for casual neighborhood encounters. Her silver hair was perfectly styled, and her expression suggested that she'd been expecting this visit but wasn't particularly looking forward to it. Karen, Margaret said, her voice carrying the kind of forced politeness usually reserved for unwanted door-to-door salespeople. I understand you wanted to discuss yesterday's situation. I wanted to discuss systematic violations of our community charter and the need for consistent enforcement of community standards, Karen replied, her tone equally polite and infinitely more dangerous. Margaret's smile flickered. Of course. Please, come in. Margaret's living room was a testament to what Karen privately called suburban intimidation decor, expensive furniture arranged to make visitors feel slightly uncomfortable, family photos positioned to highlight achievements and social connections, and enough awards and recognition plaques to establish the host's importance within the community hierarchy. Karen had been in this room dozens of times over the years, usually for HOA board meetings or community planning sessions. But today, sitting across from Margaret with her portfolio of documentation, she felt like she was seeing it for the first time. Can I offer you some tea? Margaret asked, settling into her high-backed chair with the grace of someone accustomed to holding court. Thank you, but I'd prefer to keep this meeting focused and professional, Karen replied, opening her portfolio and removing the formal complaint that she and Janet had prepared. Margaret's eyes fixed on the document with the intensity of a hawk, spotting a field mouse. Margaret, I'm here to present you with a formal complaint regarding selective enforcement of community standards, violations of transparency requirements in the community charter, and what appears to be systemic favoritism in HOA decision-making processes. Karen handed over the complaint and watched as Margaret's expression shifted from polite annoyance to genuine concern to something that looked suspiciously like panic. Karen, this is quite comprehensive, Margaret said, flipping through the pages with increasing speed. I believe in thorough documentation, Karen replied. As you can see, I've identified 14 specific instances of selective enforcement over the past 6 months, along with supporting evidence and relevant charter provisions that appear to have been violated. Margaret set the document down and looked at Karen with the kind of calculating expression that suggested she was rapidly reassessing the situation. Karen, I think there may be some misunderstandings here. The HOA board has always tried to balance strict enforcement with community harmony. Sometimes that requires flexible interpretations of certain regulations. Flexible interpretations? Karen repeated slowly. Is that what you call it when Tyler Chen can host a party with 23 attendees while the Morrison family was cited for having 11 people at their daughter's birthday party last month? Margaret's perfectly applied. Makeup couldn't quite conceal the flush that crept up her neck. Those were different circumstances. They were identical circumstances. Karen interrupted, pulling out a second folder. I have photographs, timestamps, and noise measurements from both events. The Morrison party was actually quieter and better organized than Tyler's pool party, but somehow, only the Morrisons received a formal citation. Margaret picked up the complaint again, this time reading more carefully. Karen watched as her eyes widened at certain sections, particularly the parts where Janet had outlined the legal precedents for community association dispute resolution. Karen, who helped you prepare this document? Margaret asked finally. Does it matter? It matters because this reads like it was written by someone with legal training. Karen smiled. I've had a lot of time to research community law. Margaret, 20 years of volunteer service, provides excellent education in regulatory compliance. It wasn't technically a lie, but Karen was happy to let Margaret draw her own conclusions about the extent of her legal resources. Margaret set the document down and leaned back in her chair, her expression shifting to what Karen recognized as her serious negotiation mode. Karen, what do you want? I want exactly what's outlined in the complaint. Fair and consistent enforcement of community standards. Transparent decision-making processes, and accountability from HOA board members who seem to have forgotten that they serve the residents, not the other way around. And if I agree to review our enforcement procedures, then we can work together to develop new policies that ensure equal treatment for all residents, Karen replied. But Margaret, this isn't a negotiation. These are requirements outlined in our community charter. Margaret was quiet for a long moment, studying Karen with the kind of intense focus that suggested she was seeing her longtime volunteer in an entirely new light. You realize that what you're proposing would require significant changes to how we operate, Margaret said finally. I realize that what I'm proposing would require you to actually follow the charter that you swore to uphold when you were elected to the board, Karen corrected. Karen, be reasonable. You can't expect us to cite every minor violation. The Hendersons' wind chimes, the Chen's lawn schedule, the Pattersons' garbage cans. These are small issues that don't really impact anyone. They impacted me when I was cited for similar violations, Karen replied. And they impact every resident who's been following the rules while watching their neighbors ignore them. Karen opened her third folder and removed what she'd been saving for exactly this moment. A comprehensive chart showing enforcement actions over the past 2 years, color-coded by resident and violation type. Margaret, this chart shows a clear pattern. Families like the Hendersons, the Chuns, and the Pattersons receive informal warnings or no action at all for violations. Families like the Morrisons, Johnsons, and the Whitmores receive formal citations and fines for identical infractions. Margaret studied the chart, her expression growing more troubled with each passing second. What's the common factor that determines which families get preferential treatment? Karen asked. Margaret looked up sharply. Karen, I hope you're not suggesting. I'm not suggesting anything. I'm stating facts. The families who receive preferential treatment are the ones with social connections to current board members, significant property investments in the community, or children who attend the same schools as board members' children. Karen pulled out another document, this one showing the social and professional connections between HOA board members and the families who'd received preferential treatment. Margaret, this isn't just about pool parties or wind chimes. This is about a system that's been corrupted by personal relationships and social favoritism. Margaret stared at the document for a long moment before speaking. Karen, even if what you're suggesting has some merit, you can't expect to overturn years of established precedent overnight. I'm not asking to overturn precedent, Karen replied. I'm asking you to follow the law, the community charter, the state regulations for homeowner associations, and basic principles of fair treatment. Karen leaned forward slightly, her voice taking on the kind of quiet intensity that had once convinced the entire school board to change their homework policy. Margaret, you have 10 business days to respond to this complaint with a concrete plan for addressing the issues I've documented. If your response is inadequate, I'll be filing for a community standards review under Article 7 of our charter, and if I refuse, then I'll file anyway, along with complaints to the state's Community Association Oversight Board and a request for binding arbitration. Karen smiled pleasantly. But I'm hoping it won't come to that. Margaret was quiet for a long moment, and Karen could almost see her mental calculations weighing the potential consequences of fighting this battle against the costs of backing down. What would an adequate response look like? Margaret asked finally. Karen had been hoping for this question. She removed one final document from her portfolio, a detailed action plan that she and Janet had developed for exactly this scenario. First, immediate suspension of all enforcement actions pending a comprehensive review of past decisions. Second, An establishment of a community-wide committee to develop fair and transparent enforcement procedures. Third, public apology to reside. By Wednesday morning, Karen's formal complaint had achieved something she hadn't anticipated. It had become the most talked-about document in Willowbrook Estate's history. Word had spread through the neighborhood with the efficiency of a telephone tree, and Karen's mailbox was filling up with responses that ranged from supportive to outraged to completely bewildered. Karen sat at her kitchen table, sorting through the letters and notes that had appeared overnight, like some kind of suburban fairy tale gone wrong. Mrs. Henderson from 2 streets over had written a 3-page letter defending her wind chimes as essential for spiritual harmony and bird communication. The Morrison family had sent a thank you card expressing gratitude that someone had finally addressed the obvious favoritism in HOA enforcement. The Pattersons had left a terse note suggesting that Karen mind her own business and stop stirring up trouble. But the most interesting response had come from someone Karen had never expected to hear from, Sandra Chen, Tyler's mother. Dear Mrs. Whitmore, the letter began in neat handwriting. I understand that you have concerns about our family's compliance with community standards. I would very much like to speak with you about finding a mutually acceptable solution to the current situation. Would you be available for coffee this afternoon? Sincerely, Sandra Chen. Karen stared at the letter for a long moment. In all her years of neighborhood disputes, she'd never received such a polite, straightforward request for dialogue. Usually, conflict in Willowbrook Estates involved passive-aggressive notes, complaints to the HOA, and elaborate campaigns of social pressure. Direct communication was practically unheard of. She was still pondering Sandra's invitation when her doorbell rang. Karen opened the door to find Margaret Hendricks standing on her front porch, looking significantly less composed than she had during their Sunday meeting. Margaret, Karen said, stepping aside to let her in. I wasn't expecting you, Karen. We need to talk, Margaret replied, her voice carrying a note of urgency that Karen had never heard before. The board met last night, and while there have been some developments, Karen led Margaret to the living room, noting that the HOA president looked like she hadn't slept much. Her usually perfect hair showed signs of stress styling, and her makeup couldn't quite conceal the dark circles under her eyes. What kind of developments? Karen asked. Margaret sat down heavily in Karen's armchair, looking around the room as if she were seeing it for the first time. Karen's living room was comfortable but not ostentatious family photos. Bookcases filled with actual books, and furniture that prioritized comfort over impression. It was, Karen realized, the exact opposite of Margaret's intimidation approach. Karen, your complaint has created quite a stir, Margaret began. Board members have been getting calls from residents all week, some supporting your position, others, she trailed off, looking uncomfortable. Others what? Others questioning why we've been inconsistent in our enforcement, Margaret admitted. Karen, I had 3 different families call me yesterday asking why they were cited for violations that other families seemed to get away with. Karen felt a surge of satisfaction. This was exactly what she'd hoped would happen, residents finally paying attention to the patterns of selective enforcement that she'd been documenting for months. And what did you tell them? Margaret rubbed her temples with the gesture of someone fighting a headache. I told them that we were reviewing our procedures and would get back to them. But Karen, I can't keep giving that answer. People want concrete explanations. Then give them concrete explanations, Karen suggested. Tell them the truth about how enforcement decisions have been made. The truth is complicated. The truth is that you've been playing favorites, Karen corrected. And now that residents are aware of it, you're going to have to either admit it or fix it. Margaret was quiet for a moment, staring at her hands with the expression of someone who'd been backed into a corner. Karen, what would it take for you to withdraw your complaint? Nothing, Karen replied without hesitation. Because this isn't about getting something from you, Margaret. This is about fixing a broken system. But surely there's some compromise. The compromise is in my action plan, Karen interrupted. Fair enforcement, transparent procedures, and accountability from board members. Those aren't negotiating positions, Margaret. Those are basic requirements for ethical community leadership. Margaret looked up sharply. Ethical community leadership. Karen, I've been volunteering my time for this community for 6 years. I've organized fundraisers, managed budgets, and dealt with more petty complaints than you can imagine. Don't lecture me about ethics. Karen felt a familiar surge of anger, but this time it was tempered by something else, a kind of sad understanding of how Margaret had gotten to this point. Margaret, I'm not questioning your dedication or your intentions, Karen said carefully. I'm questioning your methods. And I'm asking you to consider the possibility that good intentions don't justify unfair treatment? Unfair treatment, Margaret repeated, her voice taking on a bitter edge. Karen, do you know what unfair treatment looks like? It looks like spending your weekends mediating disputes between neighbors who can't agree on fence heights. It looks like being blamed for every policy decision, even when you're trying to balance competing interests. It looks like having someone you've worked with for years suddenly treat you like you're some kind of corrupt dictator. Karen studied Margaret's face and realized that the HOA president wasn't just stressed, she was hurt. For the first time since this whole conflict began, Karen found herself wondering what the situation looked like from Margaret's perspective. Margaret, Karen said slowly, help me understand something. When you make enforcement decisions, what factors do you consider? Margaret looked surprised by the question. What do you mean? I mean, when you decide to cite one family for a violation but give another family a warning, what goes through your mind? Margaret was quiet for a long moment, as if she'd never been asked to articulate her decision-making process. I consider context, she said finally. The severity of the violation, the residents' history of compliance, their willingness to correct the problem, the impact on neighboring properties, and personal relationships. Karen asked gently. Margaret's expression tightened. What are you implying? I'm not implying anything. I'm asking directly. Do personal relationships factor into your enforcement decisions? Margaret stood up abruptly and walked to Karen's window, looking out at the neighborhood with the expression of someone surveying a battlefield. Karen, this is a small community, she said finally. Everyone knows everyone else. Of course, personal relationships factor in. When Janet Morrison calls about a noise complaint, I know she's not the type to exaggerate. When Bill Henderson calls about the same thing, I know he probably is. That's not favoritism, that's context. Karen joined Margaret at the window, and for a moment they stood side by side, looking out at the tree-lined streets and well-maintained lawns that they'd both worked to preserve. But Margaret, Karen said quietly, what happens when that context becomes bias? What happens when some residents get the benefit of the doubt, while others don't? Margaret was quiet for a long moment. I never intended for it to be unfair, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. I know you didn't, Karen replied, but intention doesn't matter if the result is systematic inequality. Margaret turned away from the window and looked at Karen with an expression that seemed to combine resignation with something that might have been relief. So what do you want me to do? Margaret asked. How do I fix 20 years of context? Karen felt a moment of hope. For the first time since this conflict began, Margaret seemed genuinely interested in solutions rather than just damage control. You start by acknowledging that there's a problem, Karen said. Then you work with the community to develop fair procedures that don't depend on personal relationships or subjective context. And if I do that, you'll work with me instead of against me. Karen considered the question carefully. A week ago, she would have said yes immediately. She'd always preferred cooperation to conflict. But now she understood that cooperation without accountability was just another form of enabling. Margaret, I'll work with anyone who's committed to fair treatment for all residents, Karen said. But I won't pretend that good intentions are sufficient if they're not backed up by consistent actions. Margaret nodded slowly, as if this answer was exactly what she'd expected. The board is meeting tonight, she said. Would you be willing to present your concerns directly to the other members? Karen felt a surge of excitement mixed with nervousness. You're inviting me to address the board. I'm inviting you to help us figure out how to move forward, Margaret corrected. Because Karen, whether I like it or not, you've made it impossible for us to continue operating the way we have been. After Margaret left, Karen sat in her kitchen, staring at Sandra Chin's invitation to coffee and thinking about how rapidly her life was changing. A week ago, her biggest concern had been getting her pool back from her son. Now she was preparing to address the Sandra Chen's kitchen was nothing like Karen had expected. Instead of the chaotic teenager-dominated space she'd imagined, it was warm and organized with evidence of serious cooking, professional quality knives, a spice rack that would make a chef jealous, and the kind of worn cutting board that suggested years of daily use. The woman who opened the door was equally surprising. Instead of the harried working mom Karen had pictured, Sandra was calm, thoughtful, and clearly prepared for a substantive conversation. Thank you for coming, Sandra said, pouring coffee from what Karen recognized as an expensive espresso machine. I've been wanting to talk with you for a long time. You have. Karen accepted the coffee, which was perfectly prepared and served in actual china cups, rather than the generic mugs she'd expected. Mrs. Whitmore, may I call you Karen? You have a reputation in this neighborhood for being very thorough in your approach to community standards. Karen winced slightly. I suppose that's one way to put it. Sandra smiled, and Karen realized that she'd been expecting hostility that simply wasn't there. I meant it as a compliment, Sandra said. Tyler has gotten away with too much because I've been too busy with work to pay proper attention to community regulations. Your complaint has forced me to actually read the HOA charter for the first time since we moved here. And what did you think? I think you're absolutely right about the selective enforcement, Sandra replied without hesitation. And I think my family has been benefiting from it in ways that I didn't even realize. Karen set down her coffee cup, startled by Sandra's directness. In her experience, neighborhood conflicts involved months of careful maneuvering before anyone admitted fault. Sandra, I have to ask why. Are you being so straightforward about this? Sandra was quiet for a moment, looking out her kitchen window at the backyard where Tyler's pool party had taken place just 4 days earlier. Because I'm tired of pretending that everything is fine when it clearly isn't, Sandra said finally. Karen, Tyler told me about taking your pool without asking. He also told me that when you tried to address the noise complaints, Margaret Hendricks dismissed your concerns because boys will be boys. Sandra turned back to face Karen, her expression serious. That's not the kind of community I want to live in. Not for Tyler, not for any of us. Karen felt a sudden shift in her understanding of the situation. She'd been so focused on fighting the system that she'd assumed everyone benefiting from it wanted to maintain the status quo. What would you want the community to look like? Karen asked. I'd want it to be a place where rules apply equally to everyone, where conflicts are resolved through honest communication, and where families like yours don't have to choose between being good neighbors and standing up for fair treatment. Karen stared at Sandra for a long moment. You've really thought about this? I've had 4 days to think about it, Sandra replied. 4 days of listening to Tyler complain about that crazy HOA lady while knowing that he was the one who acted inappropriately. Sandra refilled their coffee cups and sat back down at the kitchen table. Karen, can I ask you something? Of course. What do you actually want to accomplish with your HOA complaint? I've read the document. It's very thorough, but I'm curious about your long-term goals. Karen had been asked this question several times over the past week, but Sandra's version felt different. Less confrontational, more genuinely curious. I want this neighborhood to live up to its potential, Karen said slowly. I want community standards that actually build community instead of dividing it. I want fair treatment for all residents, regardless of their social connections or personal relationships with board members. And how do you see that working practically? Karen appreciated that Sandra was asking about implementation rather than just intentions. Transparent procedures, consistent enforcement, and community input on policy decisions, Karen replied, but also better communication. More opportunities for neighbors to resolve conflicts directly instead of always going through the HOA. Sandra nodded thoughtfully. Like this conversation. Exactly like this conversation. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, and Karen realized that she was enjoying this discussion more than any neighborhood-related conversation she'd had in years. Sandra, can I ask you something now? Of course. How do you think other residents would respond to the kind of changes I'm proposing? Sandra considered the question carefully. I think most people would support fair enforcement if they understood what's been happening, but I also think there are residents who've been benefiting from the current system and won't want to change. Like who? Like the Henderson family, who've been ignoring noise ordinances for months. Like the Patterson family, who've never been cited for their garbage can violations. Like Sandra paused, looking slightly uncomfortable. Like your family, Karen suggested gently. Like my family, Sandra agreed. Though we're prepared to start following all regulations consistently, regardless of whether we get cited for violations. Karen felt a surge of respect for Sandra's honesty. What about Tyler? How does he feel about all this? Sandra laughed, and Karen realized it was the first time she'd heard genuine amusement in the conversation. Tyler is 16 and primarily concerned with whether this will affect his ability to have friends over, but he's also smart enough to understand that taking someone's property without asking was wrong, regardless of whether there were consequences. Has he been following the community lawn care schedule since Sunday? Every day, Sandra confirmed, and he's been checking with me before making any plans that might affect the neighbors. Karen smiled. That's more consideration than I've gotten from my own 18-year-old lately. Derek seems like a good kid who's just figuring out how to be independent. You know Derek? Tyler and Derek have been friends since middle school, Sandra explained. Derek's been over here countless times. He's always been polite and respectful, which is why I was surprised when Tyler told me about the pool incident. Karen felt a complicated mixture of pride and concern. She was glad to hear that Derek had a reputation for being respectful, but she was also realizing how much of his social life she'd been unaware of. Sandra, do you think Derek understood that taking the pool would be a problem? Sandra considered the question carefully. I think Derek understood that it might be a problem, but he also knew that Tyler's family had been getting away with community violations for months. He probably figured one more wouldn't matter. Karen nodded slowly. This perspective helped explain Derek's casual attitude about the whole incident. He hadn't been deliberately disrespectful, just following the precedent that had been set by inconsistent enforcement. Which brings us back to the systemic problems, Karen said. Which brings us back to your complaint and tonight's board meeting. Sandra agreed. Karen looked at her watch and realized they'd been talking for over an hour. The conversation had been more productive than she'd anticipated, but it had also raised new questions about how to proceed. Sandra, would you be willing to attend tonight's board meeting? As what? I'm not sure my perspective would be welcome. As a resident who supports fair enforcement and better communication, Karen replied. Sandra, if we're going to change this community, we need voices from families who've been affected by the current system in different ways. Sandra was quiet for a moment, clearly thinking through the implications. What would you want me to say? I'd want you to tell the truth about how selective enforcement has affected your family and what you think would work better, even if that truth makes my family